Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to this session on delivering net zero for all. My name's Jennifer Webber. We've got three excellent speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. But just to give a few brief introductory remarks, I think this session could just as well be called Bringing All Along on Net Zero, because what we're going to look at today is how we ensure public support for development of this important technology. So we've got three excellent speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. Just a couple of housekeeping points. When you joined the session, you should have seen a question around the best way to encourage public support for CCUS. Please do put your thoughts and views into there, and we'll have the time to discuss this further in the Q&A. And indeed, if you have any other questions for our speakers, please put them in the Hoover chat, and when we get to the end of the presentations, we'll have a good time to hear from our speakers on these questions. Just a reminder of tailoring your questions to the speaker's expertise and their ability to answer them. So, with no further ado, that leads me on to our panelists. Presenting first on BEIS's CCUS public dialogue will be Laura Jackson. Laura is the lead on that project, and we're delighted that she's here with us today to inform us more on the findings of that important project. Following Laura will be Adam Whitmore. Adam has extensive energy experience in the private sector, but is now at Bellona, so is able to give us an NGO perspective, but tailored with that private sector experience, which will be very interesting. And finally, we will hear from Professor Niall McDowell, who's based with the CCS Knowledge Centre, and he'll be able to give us a global perspective from the academic side, detailing his experience. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Laura now to give us the first presentation on the BEIS Public Dialogue project. Laura.
Thank you, and hopefully you can all hear me okay. I just did have a bit of a Wi-Fi issue, so I'm really hoping I don't drop out today. I think I had some slides. Oh yeah, okay, great. Hopefully you can all see. So yeah, my name is Laura Jackson. I work in the BEIS Power CCS policy team here at BEIS, but I also worked on our public perceptions public dialogue project, which I'm here to talk about today. Before I get into a bit of background on why we looked at public perceptions and some of the key findings, I'd just like to really encourage you to read the report that we published on this study over the summer, which is on gov.uk, as this goes into a lot more detail on the findings than I'm able to talk to you today. I'm just going to pick out some key takeaways. And before I begin, I'd just like to thank our partners in this project, UKRI, ScienceWise, and the delivery contractors Traverse, who have provided some of the content for the slides today. So I'm just, as I said, going to give a bit of background onto why we looked at the issue of public perceptions and some key findings. Could I have the next slide, please? Great, thanks. So why did BEIS look at public perceptions? At the time of commissioning the study, we knew that public knowledge of CCUS was quite low, but we also knew that, you know, we were going to progress policy development over the coming years and eventually see deployment of the technology, and that public opinion is a really key factor in the effective and successful deployment of technologies. So we really wanted to understand in more detail what people's attitudes were to CCS as they learned a little bit more about it, how these opinions formed and how they changed over time. So we commissioned this deliberative dialogue study, which is a specific form of social research where it brings together quite a small group of people to kind of really get into the detail of the topic, deliberate together, interact with specialists and experts on the issues to really get into that detailed understanding on topics and sort of build on the survey data that we had through things like our public attitudes tracker. So our study brought together over 100 members of the public across 5 locations, as you can see on the little map on the right. 4 of the locations, Aberdeen, Teesside, Liverpool and Port Talbot, were areas where, you know, could see the first deployment of CCUS in the UK. And then we also had a group of people from Nottingham in the study who you know, might be less directly affected by CCUS deployment. We really wanted to understand the range of perspectives on CCUS from these different locations and if there were any differences. So the project was conducted online last year, around this time last year actually, and covered sort of an introduction to net zero, climate change, CCUS as a technology, and some case studies from those local areas. And the findings I'm going to talk about today are data from those workshops. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So over the course of those workshops, we were always asking participants to come up with some criteria that they wanted government to consider in the rollout of CCUS. This is quite an iterative process over the course of the dialogue, but by the end, they came up with these top 10 sort of criteria that you can see on the screen. These cover a range of topics, and I won't be able to get into the detail of all of these today, unfortunately, so please go read the report if you haven't done so already. But I think this is a nice summary of some of the key findings, and I'd just like to pick up on 3 today. So if you click next, some yellow boxes should appear on the screen. So yeah, these are the 3 criteria that I just wanted to cover today, as I think they're quite interesting findings and hopefully generate good discussion. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, I'll start. Thanks. So firstly, the role of CCUS in a pathway to net zero and what people's views were. People coming to the dialogue, again, had quite low levels of awareness of, I would say, net zero as well as CCUS. But by the end of the study, all participants generally accepted the need for a kind of pathway to getting to net zero. And the majority saw this as requiring a range of approaches. And most, by the end, saw CCUS as having some role to play in this pathway. But their support was conditional on a few things. So firstly, CCUS needing to be safe, it needing to be an effective strategy in actually reducing CO2 emissions, it not being a distraction and a diversion from investment and the rollout of other strategies to get to net zero. And here people did kind of name check renewables as something that they didn't want CCUS to be competing with. And also some people saw it as a bit of like a transitional technology to like a net zero future. And again, a transition to more deployment of renewables. And it's also important to mention that a small minority of people were opposed to CCUS as being a part of a pathway to net zero, even by the end. These people generally saw CCUS as tackling the symptoms rather than the causes of climate change, and seeing CCUS as an unnatural solution, and they much preferred kind of nature-based solutions to getting to net zero. So I think this is an important sort of, it's one of the main takeaways really from the report on sort of where people ended up landing on the role of CCUS in this pathway to net zero. And I think it's an important thing to be mindful of when sort of engaging with the public on this topic is, you know, as they had more information, they were generally seeing it as something that they, you know, was necessary, but, you know, their support was conditional. And this condition of it must be safe is something that was really important to people, and sort of its own criteria, and sort of the main criteria for people. So I'd just like to pick up on that in a little bit more detail. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, participants' views on safety. The report goes into quite a lot of detail. I think there's a whole chapter just on people's views on safety in the report. And this was a key topic, like a very frequent topic of conversation through the workshops. I don't think there was one workshop that I observed that people didn't talk about safety as a concern they had, or just consideration. So it really was at the forefront of people's minds, even towards the end of the dialogue. And maybe not super surprising, but I think, yeah, I definitely took away that it was something that, you know, people really want to know about. And the analysis of the data of our study suggested that by the end of the project, people sort of had 3 different perspectives on the issue of safety. And their concerns on safety were kind of twofold. One was around the storage of safety, and if that was safe, and what would happen if there was a leak, and what would that then impact on the marine environment, what would happen to marine wildlife, you know, people talking about, is this going to create fizzy seas, things like that. And then the other aspects of the concerns on safety were around the transportation of CO2 via pipelines. Again, what happens if there's a leak? What happens to the environment in that space? I would say less so than the concerns around storage, but still quite significant topic of discussion. And then also people worried about if injecting CO2 into the subsurface was going to cause earthquakes and seismic activity. So quite a lot of concerns covering the topic of safety. But as I said, by the end, there were sort of 3 perspectives on the issue. So the first was this cautiously convinced group of people, and they were the people that by the end of the dialogue and going through this dialogue process, interacting with specialists, you know, learning about the topic, reading the materials, things like that, deliberating with people, they by the end were reassured that CCUS was safe, but they remain mindful that this was an issue, and they wanted it to be a key priority in their implementation of CCUS. The second sort of perspective on the issue were the worried pragmatists. These people had strong doubts about safety even at the end of the dialogue, but they were open to CCUS if it could be proven it was safe, and that felt like that it had a place in net zero. CCUS had a place in net zero if it was safe. And then the final perspective on the issue were people who were strongly opposed. They just thought there were too many risks involved in CCUS, and that safety could not be guaranteed for them, and so CCUS shouldn't be pursued. And these views hardened throughout the dialogue, and they sort of had held their safety concerns, and it sort of reiterated their opposition towards CCUS. So I think this was quite an interesting finding and way to look at the different perspectives people had. And I think it's a helpful insight from the report to kind of showcase the different places people will land on safety, and what sort of information was reassuring to certain people. And again, something we need to be really mindful of when engaging with the public, because this really was like a top concern for people throughout the project. And on that topic of engagement with people, the final finding there we go, thanks. Just the final finding I wanted to touch on today was the lessons we learned from the project in terms of engagement. As this, I think, is quite useful. So the report goes into detail on sort of how national level engagement, things to consider for national level engagement, and also things to consider at the local level. Can't go into everything today, but some key points I just wanted to pick up. So I think this is a common finding on these types of studies, but participants thought from our study thought that other people should know more about CCUS and be educated on the topic. But they recognized that there was a lot of information to kind of get their heads around, and tiered communication and tiered sort of levels of detail in when talking about CCUS could be helpful, as some people might not want to get into a lot of the detail, and that information needs to be easy and simple to understand. I think it's fair to say that we covered quite a range of topics in the study, and I think it's fair to say as well, people found CCUS quite a complicated technology to understand. So we really need to make it easy and simple when communicating and engaging. People also thought that framing CCUS in this context of it being part of a pathway to getting to net zero was helpful, and that it's not necessarily competing with other technologies. We need a range of technologies, and that helps sort of set the context of CCUS and the role that it plays. Particularly at the local level, inclusive and meaningful engagement, that was one of the criteria that I flashed up at the beginning. And whilst, you know, I think there's still more we need to sort of dig into on this particular finding, I think establishing trust with local communities and trusted messengers delivering on the messages of CCUS is really important, and this linked to the desire of participants to have sort of transparency around the process of CCUS and the information that was being presented to them. They really wanted, this sort of to know all of the sort of perspectives on the issue and the risks, costs and benefits of CCUS. And those who were trusted to deliver on the message of CCUS were people who, or organisations who had no sort of invested interest in CCUS working out or not, but also could credibly evaluate the impacts of CCUS. And finally, especially at the local level, maybe again, not a super surprising finding, but helpful to kind of have the insight anyway, information needing to be tailored to the local area and priorities. I haven't been able to talk about that today, but the project did, and the report goes into sort of the local nuances of the different regions of people that we spoke to, and the priorities and sort of local backdrops, and tailoring the information and being mindful of those sort of aspects could be quite key when engaging with the public in those local areas. And there's just some interesting quotes here on the slide adding to that. So I think that's all I had time for today and wanted to cover today. Hopefully that's provided some interesting insights and can stimulate quite an interesting discussion. And yeah, as I said, please do go read the report if you haven't already. That covers a lot more ground than I have done today. But I think it's safe to say, you know, for us, this is just the start of the work. We don't think the work ends here on public perceptions. And you know, we all have various roles to play in sort of establishing that trust with the public and engaging with the public. So hopefully this study can provide some useful insights when thinking about that. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. I think I'm handing over to Adam now.
Thank you, Laura. That was a really interesting way to set the scene and to lay out the scale of the challenge that particularly those of us who are communications professionals face. Handing over now to Adam Whitmore to give us the NGO and broader perspective. Adam.
Thanks, and thanks, Laura. That was very interesting, and it's a useful additional perspective, and I think it nicely complements some of the findings that came out of the Citizens Assembly work that was published last year. And it's very good that BEIS are doing this. I think clearly public acceptance is going to be a major issue for CCS. I would add one that didn't crop up there, but I've also heard expressed by some other NGOs who see support as potentially just another handout for the oil and gas sector. So I think that's another narrative that may need countering at some stage. To pick up on some of the themes that you raised, Laura, firstly, safety, I think there are several perspectives that can be helpful here. Firstly, we can point out it's a lot safer underground than it is up in the atmosphere. We can also emphasize how deep the CO2 is buried, which I think is one of those things that people often don't realize. We can talk, as you alluded to, about putting the carbon back where it came from. We can also refer to evidence elsewhere, and I'm thinking there particularly of Norway, of course, and waste storage has proved safe over decades. Together, those can all, I think, help mitigate many of the concerns. However, I do think one implication of the concern, in particular about storage, is I do perceive it as very difficult to get onshore storage in Europe. I think you'll be looking very much at offshore storage, so the North Sea, and that has implications for some of the countries around the North Sea periphery, particularly the Netherlands, the UK and Norway, which are progressing in this field. There may be opportunities there to offer storage services to countries from mainland Europe who are engaged in CCS but don't have suitable offshore storage sites. On leakage risk, it probably is necessary to transition to some sort of long-term regime, which may be different from where you started. It probably does not involve government taking all of the risks there. On funding, I think we can stress less the industry and more the jobs and skills transfer, and also UK leadership in a new industry and the potential for building supply chains and export opportunities and so forth. But I think we also need to look for an open and competitive process, and by that I mean really competitive, like you've had for offshore wind of late. And so far that seems promising with some of the approaches BEIS is developing. But that needs to be pushed further, and costs certainly need to come down. On the contribution to net zero, I thought there the public had a point, and there's some tough questions for the industry wrapped up in there. So firstly on capture rate, which was raised by someone at least in the Citizens Assembly, pointing out that you still get 10% of CO2 into the atmosphere. And even that's only, if that's only 5%, not 10%, because you've got 95% capture rate, it's still nowhere close to zero. Certainly, I don't know if this applies to anybody joining the session, but some industry participants have been advocating to BEIS that the minimum threshold for the capture rate for the industrial carbon capture support should be at 85%. Well, this is just not helpful. 85% is nowhere near high enough, and even though BEIS has robustly pointed out that capture rate will be a criterion, the fact that we've had industry suggesting 85% is not good enough is is good enough is in itself not good enough. It needs to be much higher than that. Indeed, essentially, eventually we need to move to 99% plus capture rates, because the alternative is direct air capture with CCS. So getting capture rates up and doing that at an acceptable cost is, I think, a key priority for the industry. The other one is CCU. Many uses simply delay CO2 getting into the atmosphere. Now, there are some exceptions like aggregates, but for the most part, uses that wind up with fossil CO2 getting into the atmosphere are simply not compatible with net zero. And that rules out a vast swathe of potential uses, synthetic fuels being one of them, for example. So I think one shouldn't always dismiss public concerns as ill-informed. I think in those areas they've got they've got a point, and it's something that's going to be a big challenge for the industry to respond to over the next few years. Finally, the work, we prefer renewables, to which my response is me too, but they're not doing the same job. I think we should avoid overhyping CCS and presenting it as a solution to the whole of the climate problem, but we can point out where it is legitimately complementary to things like renewables. So it can provide firm power, as was again recognised by one of the participants, at least in the Citizen Assembly work. It can tackle emissions to which there may be a long-term solution, but where a solution isn't there at the moment. So, for example, with cement, CCS is really the only solution, similar with waste incineration. Now, there may be, in the long term, new designs of cement, new non-Portland cements that are an alternative to CCS, but at the moment they're just not there. So I think there's a moderate and more credible case for CCS to develop there, and doesn't involve excessive claims for what it can and should do. Not least because it is always adding costs, unlike, for example, renewables, which can be and latterly are cheaper than high carbon generation. CCS is never going to be in that position, so for that reason alone, it will always be a challenge. So those are my immediate comments. I'm obviously happy to comment some more, but hopefully that gives them some food for thought and discussion. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Adam. Some excellent challenges there, both with and indeed to industry, but also some nice outlining of the opportunities, having worked for two areas that use a fair degree of cement, both having worked in renewables and now with the rail industry. I'm very interested to hear more about the role CCUS can play in that, for example. Now, broadening it out slightly, we have Niall McDowell. Niall has excellent experience both based here and globally, and I'd like to hand over to him to give some further remarks on the area. Niall.
Thank you, Jennifer. Obviously I had a fantastic speech prepared, but trying to follow Adam and his comments is really challenging because what he said was terribly comprehensive. Maybe to pick up on the safety point for a second. In some senses, CCS technology is so proven and safe, it's almost boring. This doesn't mean that individual elements of the CCS value chain cannot go wrong by themselves. But if you think about each piece, the capture, the transport, the storage, and so on, it's been demonstrated at scale for at least decades, if not more. Just at the capture side, this arguably starts back in the 19th century with air separation, early 20th century with amine scrubbing in the 1930s, and all of these technologies have been scaled up very successfully around the world in a range of different contexts. CO2 transport, there are thousands of miles, literally thousands of miles of high pressure CO2 pipelines transporting millions of tons of CO2 every year in the US, West Texas mostly, for at least 50 years. And again, no particular issues. CO2 storage, again, more than 20 years of CO2 storage experience, safely operating in the North Sea, Snøhvit and Sleipner. And then also in the North American context with Weyburn. So again, huge experience. Boundary Dam, for example, in Canada, 7 years of proven operation, and also Petronova and Quest for further full integrated power and industrial CCS demonstration. And I totally recognize this perfectly legitimate concern around the safety and security of geologically sequestered CO2, but it's equally important to recall that simply owing to the physics of how CO2 sequestration works, the types of different trapping mechanisms that are involved, geological sequestration, becomes safer with time, not less safe. And the technology for monitoring and verifying the location and the behavior of that CO2 in the store are well developed, and protocols are in place, and there are even ISO standards that are ready and available. So this is all kind of very much in hand. I couldn't really agree. I really couldn't agree more with Adam on this sort of the perception or misperception that there's some kind of zero-sum game between CCS and renewable energy. CCS equipped power stations, whether it's coal, gas, biomass, they can generate power in a flexible and dispatchable way, operating in synergy with renewable energy, and they can be there when they're needed and step back when they're not. And I guess it's also important to note that from the ETI in the UK to IEA or IPCC, CCS and also the greenhouse gas removal technologies that it enables, they've been consistently demonstrated to be integral and uniquely valuable to achieving the climate ambitions to which we're all subscribed, whether that's the UK net zero target or the more global well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degree target. And as far as I'm aware, there's no credible evidence that says that we can get to these targets without the services that CCS and GGR can provide. And I think we also need to be cautious in assuming that people are in fact willing to pay more than absolutely necessary for to achieve this net zero transition. And in that context, I think the French Gilets jaunes experience is a salutary lesson. And the macroeconomic implications of costly or unstable or unreliable energy system are not to be taken lightly. So I would commend and enthuse about the work that BEIS have done. I think it's fantastic, and would also just reiterate and echo everything that Adam has said. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. And really interesting points there about how much capital the industry has to use on showing its safety experience. And I note that Niall and Adam are both in violent agreement about the role that CCUS can play in the mix with renewables as opposed to, which I think is also a really interesting messaging point. Now, we have been asking you to vote in the poll, and I might start with that as a kickoff for all the panelists to discuss. Can I have the results of the poll, please? So we asked you what you thought were the major things to take forward with the public to help garner support for CCUS. And I think you can see the results there, but the highest was better education and awareness of the benefits. And the other sort of two big scorers were around building awareness of local job creation and support to the economy. That isn't something that the panelists went into too much detail on, although I do respect that they were operating with reduced time periods, and the direct interaction with local communities. And I think all of these things, from personal view, looking at it from the wind sector where I used to work, were very much a benefit in garnering support. But very interested to hear from our panel as to, do you agree with our audience, or have they got it completely wrong, and should they have been focused on early interaction with project developers, for example, or something else entirely? Can I go to Adam first, I think, on this one?
I agree with the points made, but as I think somebody that Laura, one of the quotes Laura highlighted was, you also have to have trusted sources of this information. And so if it's just coming from the industry, it will meet legitimate skepticism. And how you develop a coalition that's perceived as genuinely impartial, but nonetheless concluding that CCS projects ought to be done, I think that will be much more helpful. Otherwise, it will just seem like, if I can characterize in a slightly extreme way, just industry asking for money to play with what it does. So there is a certain tendency for the message to come across, well, climate change is a really huge problem, therefore we need really huge amounts of money from government, and it's a really urgent problem, so we need the money now. And that is not a sufficient narrative. So I'd agree entirely that pointing to some of the advantages of jobs and skills and so forth is critical, but it needs to come from a range of sources. The industry in itself will not be credible.
So the who and not just the what.
Exactly.
Laura, was that something that you found coming up in your research?
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, just on the poll, I would agree that all of those things are really important. So it is hard to sort of like pick the top ones. But I think something that surprised me a little bit was the low percentage on, I think it was, I can't see it anymore, but it's like pointing to projects on the ground or something like that. That is something I actually think in our project, and I didn't speak about it earlier, but people were really quite drawn to understanding more of. So I think when we talk about trusted messengers, I think local communities and experts who have like had experience actually deploying projects, CCS projects, were seen to be quite trustworthy people, and people that the members of public in our study anyway really wanted to hear from. So I think that's quite an important aspect to engagement. And yeah, I didn't talk about it much, but that those local nuances that we looked at in the study, and the fact that CCUS, you know, could be part to levelling up certain areas of the UK, like the jobs and the sort of economic impact that it could have, was a message that sort of resonated with participants as well. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Great, thank you. And Niall, anything from you on the poll?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, all really interesting points, but to me, the real issue is one of jobs and sort of just economic value, right? And whilst this is something that will be distinct for different countries around the world, regions like the UK or parts of North America, Canada, and so on, where there is a history of oil and gas exploration, you know, CCS will have particular value in conserving and preserving the kind of jobs and communities that exist there. And then going beyond that, it's not simply about sort of perpetuating, you know, what was there before, but also there are a lot of new, really important types of jobs and careers that track across all levels of the economy that CCS enables and facilitates. And there's been any amount of analysis, some of it published by the CCSA, if I recall correctly, you know, confirming this and sort of showing the really important economic value of enabling a CCS industry. I mean, I think the other point, maybe just to disagree with Adam slightly, perhaps, for you know, why not? Using simply the cost of generating a megawatt hour of power, so like the LCOE metric of, you know, thinking about a solar panel being cheaper than a gas CCS plant or something. I mean, fundamentally, I think that that's not the right metric to use. And certainly as we move more into this space, thinking about value creation in the context of a low carbon energy system, the portfolio of services that such a system requires is increasingly important. So I think, you know, comparing the different technologies exclusively on an LCOE basis is probably not the right way forward.
Disagreement is good. The last thing anybody wants is a panel all saying how wonderful everyone else is. So
I could say that's absolutely a fair nuance. Niall, don't disagree with that for a minute, actually. But you're right to point out I didn't say that, but it's true.
So now you are agreeing. Let's see if we can stir some disagreement on the next question that's come in direct.
Okay, go ahead.
Directed to all. Who do you think should take the lead on this public engagement that's seen to be needed? Adam, you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but should it be government, private industry, NGOs, or community leaders? And I'll go to Niall first on this one.
Ooh, okay. I think the capture technology side of things, as far as I'm, in my view, is perfectly fine. Industry should, you know, go ahead and start deploying it. That I don't believe that we need any more kind of public subsidy to develop improved technologies in that regard. Where there's a really, really important role for the public sector and government is in it getting the enabling transport and storage infrastructure deployed. Create that, you create a market, you provide a sandpit for everybody to play in, and new technologies will capture market share and the benefit will thus accrue to the private sector. But the role of the public sector, I think, is massively the deployment of the TNS infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Laura, it's just been discussed government. What do you think on the education point of view? And was the identity of the messenger something that came up in your research?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a really hard question, and I don't think we know the answer necessarily. And I think, you know, we all have different roles to play. I think that's what sort of from what I took away from the study anyway. You know, there is roles for, you know, developers are going to engage with local communities as part of like the planning process, for example, and they're going to need, you know, hopefully some of the insights in our report help sort of like inform some of that sort of engagement. You know, there is obviously a bit of an education piece that might need to be done, and who delivers that, I don't really know yet. I think that's what we're trying to work out. There's obviously like roles for the regulators. You know, one of the criteria was people really wanted to see independent regulation and oversight of like the whole CCUS chain. So, you know, I think, you know, there's a role there. And then, you know, people did really sort of really want to hear from the NGO perspective as well on the issue. And we're really quite drawn to some of the views that the WWF representative, for example, in the dialogue spoke about. So I think, you know, there's to kind of give a bit of a overall answer, yeah, I think there's like different roles that everyone needs to play, and it's not just one lead sort of person on the engagement side of things, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and my experience has been that the developers on the ground and how they do their communications is absolutely key as well. Laura touched on the NGOs though, so helpfully that cues in Adam. What do you think, Adam?
In a way, I've got little to add to what's been said, other than I think it would be helpful to get NGOs more on board. I do run into resistance from some of them for the reasons, some of the reasons that have been mentioned. But I think there is a role for dialogue with the NGOs to get them a little bit more on board on getting them firstly to agree that CCS isn't indeed necessary, and getting them to join in the messaging. And it's something we all need to work on a bit, I think.
Great. Now, drilling down into a specific area of public perception, had a question come in directed to each of you on how advanced is the environmental policy in the UK with regards to safety of CO2 transport and storage, and how important is it for public perception? Adam, as I'm with you, do you want to start on that?
I'll pass, to be honest. I think Niall, I hope he'll answer a lot better than I can.
Okay, Niall, you're up.
Thanks. No, so again, really interesting question. And, you know, so as I mentioned in my little kind of opening remarks, there are thousands of miles of these pipelines in the US context and North American context with no recognized safety concerns. I was part of a number of very large studies in the UK and and in the European context and international context, studying the safety question, and really challenged to find anything to be worried about. My understanding is the US Health and Safety Executive have looked into this in detail and didn't conclude that there was anything particularly to be worried about. And again, the ISO standards are very much in place. So I think that, you know, it is known and understood. I think what's interesting about the public perception piece is that, you know, deploying CO2 transport pipelines in the UK is very much a new risk from a public perspective. And again, it's the communication and messaging, I think, that becomes paramount importance there.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura, did you have anything to add on how advanced the environmental policy in the UK is with regards to safety of CO2 transport and storage, and how important it is for public perception? I know safety came up as a big issue.
Yeah, and yeah, I would say it's really important. People really wanted to know it was safe from like a technology perspective, but also that, you know, there was regulation and monitoring in place to ensure that. So definitely really important. I think, you know, there is an existing regulatory framework in place in the UK, and, you know, CCUS projects will have to comply with that. And, you know, storage permits, for example, you can't store CO2 without storage permit and things like that. So, you know, I think the regulatory framework is there, and, you know, it's fit for purpose, but this is something that came up as a real issue. So, you know, if there was anything to come up that you know, we think it could do better, then I guess we just keep that under review. But I think, you know, we think the existing regulatory framework is there. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say to that one.
Niall, did you want to come back in? Are you going to also praise the importance of regulators? Because I'm very in favour of that now. I currently work for one.
Absolutely, regulators are some of my favourite people. No, I mean, I guess just to say that, you know, going back to the point that I was making, CCS, all of these elements are very mature, and then CCS, as it's kind of conceived in the context of climate mitigation. I mean, there are people have been working on this since the 1990s, right? And it was conceived as a climate mitigating technology in the 80s. And all of these things have been tested to destruction, I think, you know, academically and commercially and industrially again and again and again. And I think, you know, in some senses, it's a bit sad that we're only now seeing this level of very proactive public engagement and communication, because, you know, frankly, they have a lot of catching up to do to kind of understand how much learning and understanding and knowledge there is in this space to really very completely and thoroughly answer all of the perfectly legitimate and important questions that are being proposed. I mean, nobody wants to put forward a technology or a solution that is unsafe or non-permanent or more costly than necessary, or some form of subsidy to some malign group, right? Not at all saying that anybody is, obviously, but, you know, I mean, there is, these questions are super legitimate, but equally they have been, I think, addressed very thoroughly over the years.
Yeah, the kind of issue of perception of risk is one for all communicators, I think. Questions now specifically about the cement industry, which I think, Niall, you touched on in your presentation, but apologies if it was Adam. With regards to applying CCUS in industries such as the cement industry, how would you go about not creating a lock-in effect, because production methods haven't changed since CCUS is available? No, did you want to come in on that, or am I wrong and is it an Adam one?
I'm happy to, but I do think it was Adam who mentioned it.
Okay, Adam, apologies. Over to you.
It's a good question, and I don't have a full answer. But I think it's a combination of retaining incentives to shift to new technologies such as low carbon cements, easing some of the regulatory barriers to those, but also transitioning to a model where there is no subsidy on CCS for cement, if we can, presuming we can get there. And that may involve mechanisms such as carbon border adjustments, for example, to avoid competitiveness issues. So inevitably, when you subsidize a new technology, which is essentially what's being proposed here, you get the cost down, and that creates a certain element of lock-in and incumbency. So you do need to work around that and making sure both that the full cost of the CCS becomes visible and incurred by the producer where possible, and making sure that both the barriers to novel cements and the cost of developing them are both kept in mind as the industry develops.
Great, thank you. If no one else wants to come in on that, I will.
I just very quickly say something, right?
Yep.
So Adam's points, again, predictably, completely agree. To me, I think, a lot of this comes with a sort of philosophical kind of starting point. You either believe that, let's say, fossil fuels are kind of inherently evil and must be sort of moved away from as quickly as humanly possible, or not. So there is nothing wrong, in my view, with continuing to use natural gas or coal or whatever, as long as the carbon that's created when it's combusted is not emitted to the atmosphere. It's not that the fuel is unusable, it's that the carbon is unemittable, right? Or should be unemittable. And if cement so in the context of cement, I think it's about 1/3 of the CO2 emissions are associated with the energy provision for the cement plant, and 2/3 are associated with the calcination of CO2. So, as soon as somebody comes up with a cheaper way of making a cement that will work and will actually do the things that we want it to do, and not, in the immortal words of Professor Paul Fennell some years ago, not have buildings falling down, it will simply work. So I think that this lock-in thing is a little bit overdone at times.
That's good to know. Yeah, so moving on, there are some specific questions about the BEIS study, which I will put to Laura. Just a very broad one to kick off with. Recognising that you've got the GDPR constraints, so you can't go into details of every participant. Was there work within the study to analyse the level of the scientific knowledge, and was there a correlation between understanding and opposition?
Yeah, interesting question. We didn't that wasn't the purpose of the study, so we didn't really go into that. But what we did do is I didn't do it, but the recruiting of the participants, we asked questions around their views on climate change, if it was human induced, and I think we asked if they were aware of what CCUS was or something along those lines, so we could gauge sort of the understanding of participants when they came into the dialogue. And the results from that kind of mirrored what we see in the public attitudes tracker survey data, which was low levels of awareness. But broadly, I would say, as participants learnt more about the technology and their understanding increased, I think they did get more comfortable with the idea, very generally speaking. So I wouldn't want to sort of say that's a statistically representative finding, but in general, I think that was something that I observed. So yeah.
Great, that's good to know. So there is a bit of fear of the unknown there, but you did mention that some participants hardened their opposition to CCUS throughout the programme. Do you have any indication as to why that was?
Yeah, it's something really interesting. I think it was just, I think it was specifically the safety angle, to be honest. I think they just, as we sort of talked through the technology, they just did not, they just weren't convinced, and they sort of used that as a bit of a, there's just too many risks involved, and so we just shouldn't do it. And nothing was sort of changing their minds on that. And again, they saw it as sort of this sticking plaster analogy, and that sort of furthered their opposition views. And also just thinking it was like tackling the symptoms and just being this technology-based solution that's going to fix it all, and so therefore, you know, no one has to change their behavior, things like that. And they preferred much more natural solutions. So I think it was just a combination of things, and there was just nothing really to change their mind, and so they just progressively got just further ingrained in those views, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and picking up directly on safety, were the concerns on safety all related to the long-term storage and transport rather than the capture process?
Yeah, I would say broadly, yes. The main concern was the storage. Yeah. I think there were some. We did go through the CCUS process in kind of quite high level detail, because people weren't, you know, super familiar with the technology, and we didn't want to overwhelm them too much. I think there were some concerns around the capture process, and that was like a chemical process, and, you know, not all emissions are necessarily captured, things like that. But I would say that wasn't the focus of the concerns around safety. It was more on the storage aspect.
That's good to know. And finally, on the report, we've been asked, did the process provide information on natural gas being stored for many decades below cities in places like the Netherlands and Germany, and indeed the UK's history of storing natural gas in subsurface offshore storage sites?
Yeah, I guess kind of when we were trying to sort of explain the technology, and I think some specialists were, when they were in the workshops, trying to sort of answer people's questions. I think one specialist did sort of frame it as putting carbon back where it came from, and that, you know, natural gas didn't like leak before we started drilling for it, and that sort of narrative. So that was sort of touched on. And also, I know you didn't ask about this, but like the fact that we use pipelines to transport natural gas, like I think that's what some participants found a bit more like reassuring for when we were talking about transporting CO2 via pipelines. You know, we do this already, that kind of thing. So yeah, we did sort of touch on it. And yeah, having other countries as sort of case studies, and, you know, saying, look, you know, this is happening elsewhere. It's not just what the UK is looking at doing. That was also quite a helpful message for people.
Thank you very much. Now, final question for the panelists, slightly controversial. It's directed towards Adam, but I will bring in anyone else who wants to come in. Regarding driving capture rates up to 99%, this is likely to increase cost and as a result slow down the rate of adoption. Could the pursuit of the perfect 99% capture get in the way of deployment of the good 85% capture, especially if the alternative is import of goods with 0% capture? Now, we're short on time, but concise answers, please.
Okay, briefly. The reason for 99% plus is if you're looking at net zero, the 2050 goal, the alternative for the residual is direct air capture, which is very expensive and works at very low concentrations, specifically atmospheric concentrations, which are about 1/100th of those in a typical flue gas. To me, it's a direction of travel, and we don't need to be at 99% plus for the first generation of projects, but we need to be better than 85% because that's hardly even proving the technology. So talking about 99% plus, I was talking about that for future projects where I think it is absolutely necessary. I don't think the first generation needs to be at that level, it just needs to be better than 85.
Okay, better than 85. Niall, agree?
Yeah, I mean, 85 is kind of a joke. You're already seeing Johnson Matthey will give you a performance guarantee at 95% for hydrogen production today. Boundary Dam, we're capturing 95%. Petronova, we're capturing 90%. You know, this this isn't an issue. I guess where I might depart slightly from Adam is, I mean, yes, we do need, net zero means net zero, so that means any residual emissions will have to be compensated for. How the costs increase in line with rate of capture, it varies as a function of CO2 source. And to me, a credible alternative for compensating for residual emissions instead of doing it with direct air capture, Adam, yeah, I think it's probably quite a costly way to do it, maybe. Bioenergy CCS could be a way forward as well.
Great, thank you. Good question to finish the session on. Thank you all for attending and the interesting questions, and of course a special thanks to Niall, Adam and Laura, our excellent panelists. Coming up next at 3:15 there's a session on negative emissions and how we can deploy a CO2 removal sector. Tomorrow the conference starts bright and early at 8:30 with the first of 2 sessions profiling the cluster project, so make sure you're around for that. And at 10:30 tomorrow, the conference will be joined by the Secretary of State, Kwasi Kwarteng, which I'm sure you won't want to miss. Again, thank you all very much for your attendance, and thank you to our panelists. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody.